Hello, my name is Michael Smith, and today we're going to make a virtual tree trunk and cut virtual bits of wood out of it as a way of making procedural wood. And I think you'll find that you get a better quality of procedural wood by following this process than you do some of the other simpler ways of doing it, including the one I have on my channel for a simple wood texture. So without further ado, I am using Blender 3.0. You don't have to use Blender 3.0. Blender 2. Anything should have more or less the same functionality, but some of the things look a little bit different, so that might be surprising. In here, the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and get rid of the default cube, left click, press delete, and we're going to go to add, mesh, cylinder, because we want a tree trunk. And we're going to go ahead and click this little thing at the left-hand side after we add cylinder that lets us change the parameters of the thing we just added. And I'm going to up the number of vertices so that this is a bit more detail, and I'm going to change this to a 0.75 meter radius, which is still a pretty large tree, and then a depth of, let's say, 5 meters. So a 5 meter chunk of our trunk here. The next thing I'm going to do is take this cylinder, select it with left click, press G for grab, Z for Z axis, and I'm going to bring it up till it's roughly at the 0 point. If you remember correctly, this was 5 meters, so 2.5 meters up in the Z direction puts us at 0. Great. And now the next thing I'm going to do is go to add, mesh, cube. The reason I'm doing this, I want to cut out a section. Obviously, the whole point is we're going to cut out sections for wood. If I just show you the trunk, you're not going to be able to see what the wood grain looks like. So we're going to take that cube we just added and say grab X, move it a bit this way, and then grab Y and move it a bit that way, grab X, maybe a bit back, grab Z, so this is in the middle. So far not cutting anything, I'll get there. So now we're going to select this cylinder, again left click. We're going to go over here to the modifiers tab. What this lets us do is take the base geometry and then change it in some way, and in a way that's non-destructive. So if you want to remove it again, you just delete the modifier. It's not permanent. So we're going to go ahead to add modifier, and we're going to go to Boolean, and we're going to say difference. We're going to select, in this case, the cube, which is the only cube in this picture. And now we're going to go to the cube over here in the scene collection, which is this guy. You can see we're now selecting it, and make it invisible. And now what you've seen, I'm going back to select the cylinder, is that we've got this cutout of the cylinder so we can see part of it. The final thing I'm going to do, I'm going to click on this, again, left click, right click, say shade smooth, so we get a nice smooth shading, except gross. What's going on there? Well, what's going on there is that it does not handle corners nicely. We can fix that though, like it's trying to smooth over where the corner is. We basically want it to have sharp corners. The way we're going to do that is go back to the modifiers. Again, in this modifier tab here, we're going to go to add modifier. We're going to go to, what is it? Edge split. And this says if there's anything over 30 degrees, go ahead and split that as a hard angle. And now all those, the cutout and the edges are not smooth, but the outside is smooth. So that's what we want. Okay, so we've got our tree trunk. Now that we have our tree trunk, what we're going to do is go ahead and shade it. So I'm going to go up here to the shading tab. I'm going to go down here and select the default material so that we're assigning that to our cylinder. I'm going to go to the top left corner of these windows and drag them to the left to close these other two because I don't need them. And that'll give us more space. And I'm going to move this up a bit and then center that a little bit. Okay, perfect. So tree trunk, first step. What we want to do is take this tree trunk and create tree rings. The tree rings need to go from the Z-axis, essentially coming out of the Z-axis, out to the edge, and we want them to go the whole way through the trunk, obviously, because if we're cutting things out of the trunk, we need that texture to be three-dimensional. So what we're going to do is go down to the texture, say add, input, texture coordinates, and we're going to use the object texture. The reason we're going to use the object, with a mistake, which I'll fix in a second, the reason we're going to use object for the texture coordinate is that we want 3D coordinates that go through the object. UV is not. UV takes a 2D flat plane and wraps it on your object, so that's not useful here. Generated does 3D coordinates, but it scales them to the bounding box of the object. So in other words, your generated coordinates are going to be 0 to 1 along the z-axis in terms of the bounding box, but also 0 to 1 along x and y-axes, also according to the bounding box. So it's instead of 0 to 5, which is the actual dimension, you get 0 to 1 this way, and instead of the 0.75, whatever we're doing this way, you get 0 to 1 in both directions. So that's not what we want. We want the scaling to be different. And what the object coordinates do with, again, an error that I'm going to fix shortly, is that they take the object and just take any point on this object in the global space. Now, I say that, you can see that all of these are converging on 0, 0, 0 halfway up the object, even though 0, 0, 0 is here. And the reason for that is we translated this object, but we didn't apply that transform to the object. What do I mean by that? If we go over here and we click on object properties, you can see the location is offset along Z by 2.5 meters. What this means is the actual mesh, when we apply the texture, is still centered with the center of the cylinder at 0, 0, and then we do the texture and everything, and then it moves it up afterwards, and we can fiddle with this number without changing the mesh. We don't want that. We want 0, 0 to be at the bottom. So I'm going to go to Object, I'm going to go to Apply, I'm going to All Transforms, and boom. Now, the mesh actually starts at 0, 0. You can see the scale, location went away, and now the coordinates look right. Okay, so that's step one. Step two, we're going to go ahead and create a value for the distance from this Z axis to the edge. And the reason we want to do that is we need to compute our distance from the Z-axis and then make a function that makes waves going out from the Z-axis, and that'll make rings. So to do that, we're going to go to Add, Converter, Vector Math, and the first thing we're going to do is multiply by x and y 1 and z 0, because we don't care about z, right? We're trying to find the distance from the z-axis, so where we are along the z-axis makes no difference, it's just the x and y. And so now we're going to do add converter vector math, and we're going to change this to distance, which is down here. And distance from 0, 0, what this is going to compute is the xy distance, right, from 0, 0, xy. Ignoring z, which will effectively give us the distance from the z-axis. And you can see if I plug that into the color, there we go. We have this black dot in the center where the z-axis is, so 0 distance from z-axis, and then it goes out to white as we go away from it. Okay, now that we've computed the distance from our z-axis, we want to add a wave to it. There's a bunch of functions you can do. You just need a function that goes effectively 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1 to make a repeating pattern of rings. What we're going to do now is use modulo. Last time I used sine. You can use that too. We'll use modulo. So go to Converter, Math. Instead of add, we're going to go to modulo, if I can find it. Please excuse my brain while I remember where this is. Compare, modulo, there we go, modulo. And what this is going to do is basically it ramps from 0 to this number and then rolls back over. So we're going 0 to 0.5, and then 0.6 is now going to be 0.1 again, back up to 0.5 for 10, et cetera, et cetera, well, 1.0, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it creates this nice repeating pattern. We're going to repeat on ones because I want it to go from 0 to 1, all the way from minimum to maximum color. The problem with that, of course, is that it's farther than 1 to go outside the trunk, so we're not getting any rings. So now what we're going to do is add converter math. We're just going to multiply this distance value. So instead of the distance going from 0 to under 1, now it's going to go multiply from 0 to, whatever. Let's say 10, and we'll fiddle with this later. So now we have a set of rings going from the z-axis, and those rings are repeating, a configurable number of times based on this parameter. Okay, now that we have our rings, this actually isn't yet right. So I didn't really know this, I had to look it up online, but it occurred to me as I was doing this that clearly rings in a tree don't go straight up, because the tree is not a cylinder. It doesn't just end the same size it starts as. So, and I think that the rings actually change number as you go up. So I thought, well, how does that work? And it turns out the way it works is that each ring doesn't go constantly up. It actually forms a cone. And so you add more cones on the outside, and you get this sequence of cones going all the way up to the top. And of course, as you get near the top, you have fewer cones. So that's how it transitions up. So even though if you look at the cross section, each one is just rings, those rings are constantly shrinking in towards the center of the trunk until they vanish. And you're adding new ones on the outside, or not, of course, as it gets smaller. And that's how the rings change as you go up. And that's important because if you cut wood just out of this, some of the feature you're going to expect out of like a 2x4 or whatever, you're not going to have unless you have these rings actually changing as they go up instead of going straight up. You're not going to get the same patterns. So how do we do that? So the way we're going to do that is we're going to add converter, separate x, y, z, and we're going to drop the coordinate in there. And then what we're going to do is add an offset to this calculation. So basically what we want to do is as we go up, we want the ring, instead of staying in one place, to get closer and closer to the center. So we're going to go ahead and go to Add, Converter, Math, and we're just going to add the z-axis. So if we do that, now you can see side on, these rings, instead of going straight in, now look like they're going up at an angle. And we can change that angle by going to Add, Converter, Math, and just add a divide here, so that as we want the angle to get steeper, you just divide by more, and you get a different effect depending on what you do there. So when I did it last time, a higher steepness seemed more natural. I haven't looked inside a tree. I don't actually know what's reasonable for different trees, but making this a little bit higher made sense. So I'm going to leave it there for the moment, and we can play with it later. But now what you get, instead of just at the top they look like rings, but from the side you see that these are actually peaks. Okay, so what we're going to do now, we've got our rings. We're going to go ahead and select all of this and use Control G to make a node group, so that we can just clean up the visual aspect of this in the main diagram, and I'll explain that in a minute. So what this does is it just takes all of that and makes it a single node, which has all your nodes inside. I'll show you how to navigate. If you want to go into the node, I've now jumped out, you click in this top right corner. And once you're in, if you want to go out, you click this little button here. Now, what it does by default, even though this is the same input coordinates, because of the way I created it, it creates it twice. Rather than doing that, we're just going to use one input twice and ignore the other one. To get rid of that, we're going to go over here to the top right corner. There's this little arrow. Pull that out, go to Group, select the second vector, and just press minus to get rid of it. So now we have a single input, which is the coordinate system. We're going to do a couple things. We're going to make the slope configurable by taking this little empty circle and dragging it onto the value. And what we're going to call that value is slope. So this will control that slope of those rings. And then we're also going to control the count, right? The multiplier here that changes how many rings we have. So we're going to change that to count. And now if I press this little out button, I have one component. It has slope and count. We can change the name by clicking on this here, and we're going to call it tree rings. So now we have a node called tree rings with some configuration in it. And instead of cluttering up our whole space with all that logic, we've just got one thing. Okay, so now that we have our rings, what we want to do is distort those rings as we go up the z-axis. So we don't want these rings to be perfectly circular around the center. We know that the trunk is going to change shape as we add branches or warts or whatever, just as it grows. And we want this to be wobbly. If you look at tree trunks, these are not exact, obviously. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to permute the x and y coordinates as we go up the z-axis, so that we make these rings a little bit wobblier. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to add texture, noise texture, take in the object coordinates. What this is going to do is create a nice smooth noise. So in other words, rather than giving you completely different values for every x, y, z you put in, if you put in an x, y, and z that are next to each other, you're going to get out values that are close to each other. So it moves up and down randomly, but it doesn't move completely randomly. Think hills and valleys rather than static. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take that, we're going to do add, converter, vector math, and we're going to take the color, which is a three-dimensional coordinate, right? Red, green, blue. We're going to treat that as a three-dimensional coordinate value. Fac would be 0 to 1, so that would just give us one dimension. And the first thing we're going to do is get rid of the z. We don't want to move up and down. We just want to move side to side. So we're going to do that first. And then what we're going to do is just add that into our coordinate system. So we're just going to change the x, y so that they're farther out or closer in. And the way we're going to do that, add, converter, vector math, take our coordinate system and add in that x, y. So first thing, that's too much, right? So we're going to reduce the scale of that down. There we go, that's a bit better. The other problem is that you can't see the center anymore. What's happening is this red, green, blue are values from 0 to 1. So on average, they're at 0.5. So on average, you're moving everything by 0.5 off center. So what we're going to do is just go ahead and offset that again. So add, converter, vector math, subtract, and we're going to do minus 0.5, well, subtract 0.5 to each axis. And that'll move your center back in. Now, the only problem there as we play with this is we're still kind of moving the center around. And I kind of want this effect not to apply to the core of the tree. I don't want the core of the tree moving around yet. So what I'm going to do is take this and multiply this effect by how far we are from the z-axis. So to do that, this should look familiar. Add, converter, vector math. We're going to multiply. We're going to take the object coordinates. We're going to pull out the x and y. Then we're going to select this multiply, Shift D to duplicate. It's just another vector math. We're going to do distance. We're going to take this in distance from 0, 0. So now we're finding the distance to the center. And that's going to be 0, obviously, near the center. And then we're going to take this, and we're going to multiply it. Add, converter, vector math, multiply. And now we're going to multiply that by how far we are from the center. So as we do that, wait for Blender to catch up and show this again. So what's going to happen is now it's not moving the center. Now how much we want that to apply in the center versus out of the center, we want to fiddle maybe with that gradient. So I kind of want it to be relatively still in the center and then bumpier on the outside. The way we can do that is add, converter, color ramp. So color ramp lets you take an arbitrary 0 to 1 value and manipulate it exactly how it transitions. So for instance, as I move here, what I'm doing is I'm saying this is going to be 0 for a lot more of the lower end of the range, or I can make everything 1 by dragging this in. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and make this more 0. Now if I move it all the way to the center, what's happening? I did something weird. Oh, sorry, distance 0, 0. Not the distance from the center. There we go. Okay, so now if I do this, as you can see, it impacts farther out. If I move it this way, it's in, and what I want to do is actually get more impact going through the log, just not right at the center. So if I do this, I get good wiggliness inwards, but keep it reasonably consistent in the center. The final thing is, this may or may not, depending on your preference, be too wobbly in terms of side to side. So how much this trunk is changing seems kind of extreme as you go up the z-axis. So the other thing I'm going to go ahead and do is do this. Add, converter, combine x, y, z, and I'm going to do add, converter, vector math. Oh, sorry, wrong one. Delete with reconnect, add, converter, vector math here. And I'm going to basically just stretch out the noise texture. So right now, when z is 0, this is 0, and when z is 1, it's 1. If I multiply just the z-axis by something less than 1, I'm going to stretch out the texture along that z-axis. So so where z was 1 before, if I multiply this by, let's say, 1.5, now z where it was 1 is going to be 0.5, and I can stretch that out to make this a bit smoother. So now I'm changing the shape of the trunk, but I'm changing the shape of the trunk much more gradually along the z-axis than the changes in the xy axis. So there we go. Now what we've done is made the trunk wobble. So I'm going to go ahead and make another vector group, node group for that. Let's take this whole thing, except the input parameter, Control G, and then now what we have. Oh, you know what? I'm going to undo that. So one way to have it stop repeating this vector over and over, if you do Shift, right-click, now we combine all of these vector outputs into a single point. If I put that point inside the node that I'm creating, and let me zoom out so I can make sure I'm doing that, and now I do Control G, I just get the one input. Okay, so the other thing I want to do is make sure I name these properly. So this is the scale Z factor. In fact, oh man, you can tell this one is unscripted. Just joking, they're all unscripted. So we're going to undo all of this again. Okay, great. So now what I'm going to do, I made a mistake. This is going to be in there, and I just want to pipe in Z as a parameter. So we're actually going to select all of this. So you'll scale just the Z parameter. We'll do Control G. Okay, there we go. And now what I'm going to do is if I want to change the scale of the Z, this empty one, I'm going to plug just into Z. Y should be 1. And now when we go out, we've got this ability to change the scale of the Z of what I'm going to call the XY wobble. So let's call this XY wobble. So along the Z-axis, we're now wobbling the X and Y values, and you can change how much that's stretched along the Z-axis depending on what you want to do with the wood. So we're almost there to what I'm going to consider a realistic tree trunk. Okay, now we have our XY wobble, we have our tree rings. Now what we're going to do is I actually want the center of the tree to move back and forth. And if you look at trees, of course, as the tree bends or whatever, the center is not going to be 100% straight up and down for all kinds of wood. So why don't we do that? So the way that we're going to do that is now we're going to take add converter, separate XYZ. And what we want to do is get one offset, basically, for each Z value for the whole of the trunk. So we're not changing every value all the way throughout the trunk. We're just saying we're going to move where 0 is. So from here, we're going to take add texture, noise texture. We want it to be gradual. Obviously, the center doesn't just jump around. It moves in a gradual way. We're going to plug Z in. And what this is going to do is give me a new value for the noise texture just when Z changes. And we want an X and a Y offset, so we're going to use color again, but we're going to do add, as we do, add converter, vector math. We're going to put in the color here, and we're just going to multiply by 1 and 1. I realize this is add. I will fix that. Multiply 1, 1 for X and Y. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to offset the entirety of the frame by that amount. So before, we were getting a different noise value for each point, X, Y, and Z. Now we're just getting one value for each Z, and we're adding it to all the points, and that's going to offset this. As with before, this is going to make it, on average, 0.5 by 0.5, right? It goes 0 to 1, so on average, it's offsetting the trunk by 0.5 in each direction. So we don't want that. What we're going to do is add converter, vector math, and we're just going to offset this with a subtract by 0.5, 0.5, and that way, on average, we're actually going to be at center. Okay, great. So having done that, we just need one more vector math. I'm going to select the subtract, Shift D, change it to add, drop it on this line, and then add in our random value. Now, this is too much, obviously, right? Like you can see that the center is moving quite a bit constantly. So what we're going to do is just reduce the scale. And this is going to stretch out that texture in all directions. We're only along Z at the moment, so it's going to stretch it out just along Z. And you can see at the top here, we can see that it's moving, but now it's not moving in quite as drastic a way. Okay, great. So now what we've got is we've got our XY wobble, our tree rings, and our center wobble. So I'm going to go ahead and take this set of nodes, press Control G, and then press this little button to come back out. Oh, I forgot to make one input for the vector. So let's get rid of the second input of our coordinate system. We're going to back up. Great. We're going to put it here, and we're going to call this center wobble. Okay, so now what we want to do is start cutting things out of this. Okay, so we've got our tree rings. We've got them tented in pyramids like they're supposed to be. We've got our XY wobble so that things aren't just straight around the center. And now we've got our center wobble so that the center actually moves a bit. And we can configure all of those. I'm going to go ahead and just quickly make it so that we can change the scale outside. So if you wanted to get rid of this, you could just change the scale to 0. We can already effectively do that here by changing Z to 0, so we don't have to fiddle with that. And then for tree rings, we've already got our configuration. Okay, perfect. So now what we want to do is basically, carve out a piece of wood and take a look. So the way that that works is we just go ahead and do add mesh cube. We're going to make this look a bit more like a 2x4 or similar. Of course, Being an American, I don't remember my metric, but let's say we're doing approximately a 2x4x6. So that's going to be about 2 meters on one side. That makes sense. What we want to do is change the proportions. So we're going to scale X, and I'm not going to get this exactly, and then scale Y. Okay, so looks like some sort of piece of wood. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take that and do Object, Apply, All Transforms. So now what's going to happen, and I'm going to grab Z, and move it up by 1. So it's actually in this trunk that we've been developing. Okay, great. Then I'm going to go to Object, Apply, All Transforms, and now I'm just going to use the material we already created. So what this is going to do is basically give you the 3-dimensional texture cutout of this piece of wood as though it was in this position of exactly this trunk. So if I take this and grab X, ta-da, there you go. And there's some nice things about this. You get, again, this nice wavy pattern, and we can play around with the features there. So you get stretching like you would. Depending on where this wood is, you're going to get different stretching on different sides of the wood, right? Looking at different sides in different ways and playing around with these parameters. Like, for instance, let's make the slope huge. As we make the slope huge, these become more straight as we make it, right? Because this is closer to the ring, just goes infinitely upwards. As we move it farther down, we get more of a curve like this, so we can play around with that. We can play around with the wobble, etc. So pretty nice. The other thing you're getting is you get real end grain, right? Unlike 2D textures, this is going to look like an end grain, and where it is in the wood is going to impact sort of what that end grain looks like. So this is looking pretty good. The only thing we need to do now is go ahead and add the details. So we've got our tree. We can cut chunks out of it. We can move this chunk around, obviously, and get different parts of the space. And now what we want to do is add details and color, so we'll do that next. Okay, so the first detail I want to add is that you actually have, if you look at, like, I'm looking at my wood floor here. If you look at your wood floor, in addition to having these patterns, you also have what I think are called pores, but like little specks that move vertically along the trunk that are in the wood that add some additional texture to it. And so we're going to go ahead and add those. So the way we're going to do that is we need something to make a number of random specks, and then we need to stretch those specks out so that they make lines along the z-axis. And I'm going to do that with a add texture, Voronoi texture. So Voronoi texture, let's just go ahead and plug that right in. If you remember from built-in procedural textures, this is going to create basically a semi-random set of blocks. And so how do we turn this into a bunch of spots and then streaks? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do add converter color ramp. So you remember color ramp takes an input like this color. Now we convert this color to a single value grayscale between 0 and 1. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make a mask. So we want the dots to be 0 in this case, black, and we want everything else to be white. And the way we're going to do that is we're just going to, sorry, shouldn't have done that. We do constant, so there's not a gradient, it's just either black or white. And what we're going to do is filter out the white until we have a bunch of black spots, and then we're going to stretch them vertically. Before we do that, of course, these spots are too big. So we're going to go ahead and scale this down. Oh, sorry, the other way, up. So we have a lot more dots. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go to add converter vector math, and we're going to multiply. So we want to, let's start with 1, 1, 1. So what we want is we want to stretch out the Z. We also want from the top, remember this is going to be your end grain, we want these dots to be a size that's like reasonable to an end grain. So I'm going to keep on scaling. And in fact, this, the way this scale works, still makes some blobs that are bigger and some that are smaller, which I don't love. So probably what we need to do, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, let's start there. And then we're going to stretch these out along the z-axis. So the way we're going to do that is take the z-axis and multiply it out like that. So that's still too big. Keep scaling. Okay, this, I'm looking at some wood next to me. That's a little bit on the large size, but we're getting there. Okay, let's call it a day. So this is going to make our pores, and what we want to do is mix that in with the tree rings. So the way we're going to do that is add converter, where is it? Oh, sorry, add color, mix RGB. we're going to take the rings we already have, and now what we're going to do is add a darken. So what we want to do is where the first bit is lighter than the second, we want to darken it with the second one. Oh, I plugged that into FAC. So we're going to take that, we're going to take this, and we're now going to mix it. So the dark spots from the pores are going to be added into the darkness from the waves. And that actually looks pretty good. You can fiddle with this, you can make them stronger or weaker relatively. We're going to adjust how strong this is when we add colors, obviously, because right now this will be a bit much. But there we go. So detail 1, we added pores. Next, what we're going to do is add color. Okay, so now we have our rings and we have our pores. Let me go ahead and quickly take this, do Control G to create a node group, click out of it by clicking on that button, move it over here and call it pores. Now we want to add color. So the way that color works with wood is also kind of fun. The way that it works is that it actually changes as you go from the center outside. So like if you have cedar and you look at cedar planks, some of them are red, some of them are lighter red, some of them have a mix of dark and light red or red and almost white. And the reason for that is that the color actually changes as you go from the center outside. So the wood near the center of the trunk, the heartwood, is going to be the nice, really red wood. It's going to be very resistant to bugs, etc. And as you go outside, you get closer to what's called the sapwood, which is the newer wood, and it's going to be very light. And so that change in coloring from the inside to the outside is part of what gives you your color, in addition to things like rings. So let's go ahead and we're going to go and define our color. So the way we're going to do this is we're actually going to take these tree rings and have an output for the distance. So we want to be able to apply the color as the rings expand from the center outwards. So we don't want it to just be the z-axis, because that's going to look very dull when you put it on a piece of wood. What we want it to do is move along with the rings and the z-axis, so you get those nice patterns. So what we're going to do, if you remember from this component, this is the distance from the center that we use to create the rings. We're just going to pull that out, and we're going to call it R by taking that value and connecting it to an empty circle here, and then renaming it on the right-hand side. Now we're going to back out, and now we're going to take this R, and we're going to go to Add Converter Color Ramp. By default, what this is going to do is map the radius just from black to white as it goes from 0 to 1. If it goes below 0, it's going to be black. If it's above 1, it's just going to be white. And so if we plug that color in, we're going to get more or less what we got before, except with some wobbles, which is going to be the distance from the z-axis. But now the distance from the z-axis with all the wobbles that we've created applied to it. So now what we want to do is we want to change that color from the center outwards. So I'm going to try and do cedar-ish. This took me a long time to, I'm not good at picking colors. This took me a long time before. So I might fast forward through this till we get it right. But what we're going to do in the center is have, you know, a reddish brown. So we're going to go over here somewhere and darken it. And then we're going to go here and we're going to start with the same reddish brown. So let me zoom in so I can do that. So select this guy, select the little eyedropper, select the same color, and out here what I want to do is move to a lighter and yellower color like that, and maybe even like that. Okay, so now what we're going to do, this is too smooth. If you look at a trunk, that's not what that is, and we're going to just sort of expand the center a bit and add some color. So we're going to take this and we're going to make it also this color. So now you get this pretty solid center blotch coming out, which is what you'll see. So usually you'll see most of the trunk is one of the darker colors and then it's light around the edge. And then we're going to go ahead and add some variation here just to tighten up this color range. And then we're going to add maybe... Okay, so that's not terrible. I'm sure many of you can do better, but you get the idea. So what we're going to do is vary this color as we go out from the center. And now all we need to do is take that color and apply the grain to it. So how do we do that? So now we're going to do Add Color, Hue Saturation, put the color in here. Put the value of the grain into Value, and the color into here. And what that's going to do is it's going to vary the brightness of the color by the grain, but use that color as sort of the base. And so if we plug that in and give it a minute to think, there you go. And now you'll notice these grains are a bit too much. So we're going to just reduce the factor, which is how much that's going to show up in the wood. And we're actually starting to get a really nice texture maybe a bit dark in this case, but you can fill around with the colors. And we can get different cuts of this. So we did this before, right? So we can do Shift D to duplicate. I'm going to take the cylinder, go here to the object properties, and reset the location. And then we're going to grab Y, so G for grab, Y for Y, grab, G for grab, X for X. We're going to move it to a different part here. We're going to go to Object, Apply, All Transforms. Then we're going to do grab, G for grab, X for the X directory. And here you go. Now, using the same texture, but moving it around in the tree, we get a completely different pattern. And depending on how close this is to the core or to the edge, we can fiddle around with what detail we're seeing there. And we can do things like, of course, if we want, we can add more count of rows, of rings. So if that's not enough rings, we can add in more rings. And we get this really nice pattern. So what we've done so far, we've created a trunk, we've done the rings, we've done the color, we've done the pores. We combined that together, we applied the pattern to the color. Next, what we're going to do is this material doesn't look very much like wood. It looks like plastic, obviously. We're going to adjust some of these other properties to make it look a little bit more like, in this case, polished wood. Okay, so to do that, I mean, you could use the Eevee. I don't. I'm going to go up here to the render properties, and we're going to switch to cycles. We're going to use the supported feature set in this case. We're going to go to GPU compute. You don't need to have it, but it'll make things faster if you do. And then up here, we're going to go to viewport shading. So instead of using the other window, the preview window, we're actually going to shade using the real rendering engine. The next thing we're going to do is, I don't like this light, so bear with me. We're going to go to Object, World, and we can do better than this, but for the moment, in fact, why don't we do better than this? Add, so this now controls the worldwide texture, so the lighting texture that's the environment around your object. And there are a bunch of ways to do that. You can use an image, which is what I would normally do, but for the purposes of getting moving, let's do sky texture, and let's just plug in the default sky texture. And what this is going to do, as you can see, is give us a nice bright sunny day. So we get some light on our wood that looks a bit more like outdoor light, and then that's a bit too much outdoor light, frankly. So let's reduce the sun intensity a bit. Okay, great. So now what we can do, I'm also going to move around to this side, just so we get maybe some, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we just move the position of the sun? So there's a sun rotation. Yeah, okay, there we go. So we get a little bit more of a variation of the light across the object. And then let's just grab, what did I do? Deleted it somehow. G for grab, Y, move that out. Okay, great. So we now have some of our objects, and we've got light on them, and we've got a little shade here. It looks a bit better already just because we're doing a ray trace. But what we're going to do is update some of these properties. So we're going to go back, select this guy, this wood here. We're going to go from world back to object. From object, now we're going to play around with this other stuff. So there's a few things that we want to do. One of what we want to do is we actually want this texture to influence how light bounces off the wood. We also, assuming we're going for like a floor, for instance, we're going to down the roughness a bit to make this a bit shinier. So you can see now, if you look where the light's bouncing off this guy, this is going to look a bit more like a shiny wood floor than it did before because we're reducing the roughness. And then what we're going to do, like I said, is influence how the light bumps off. So what we're going to use is what's called a bump map. And what a bump map is going to do, if you look at wood really closely, of course, these pores and where these dividers are, where these rings are, introduce a little bit of variation in the wood as you go across in the vertical height. So what we're going to do, rather than modeling that change in height, we're just going to use a bump map to change the way light bounces off. And this will be pretty straightforward. We're going to add vector, bump, and then for height, we're just going to take this texture we already have, we're going to plug it in as height, and we're going to take out normal, and we're going to plug it into normal. Now, immediately, you'll see here, it's going to do too much, right? Like, as we move around, that's too much. We don't want that much bump. What we're going to do then is back off this strength until there's just a little bit. In fact, even less. Let's go to point. Okay, so now what's happening is the pores and the texture of the wood are changing the way that the light bounces off. So as we do like a floor or something like that, instead of just getting it bouncing off directly, you're going to get a little bit of bump map. Now there are more things we can do for the purposes of what we're going to do next with this, making a wood floor. This is pretty good. Let's just, I don't know, throw a couple more things in here like a monkey. So for instance, if you now want to do carved objects, we've shown how you get nice end grain and so forth on bits of wood. Well, okay, what about a monkey head? So let's go to add mesh monkey. We're going to scale it down, grab with G, Z, grab, oops, pressed H, sorry, G, Y, move it to a different part of the trunk. Of course, it doesn't have to be in this cylinder. The texture extends out the edges. Grab X. Okay, and now we're going to do as we did before, object, apply all transforms, select the wood material, and then we're just going to grab X, and then if you want to see what that looks like, we're going to right click on it, shade smooth, and it's still got a pretty low polygon count, which is going to affect the way that this texture lays out on it. So the other thing we're going to do is go to this modifiers, add subdivision surface, and we're going to subdivide a couple times. And there you go. Now looking at it, that's a little too shiny, so we're going to up the roughness a little bit. And maybe reduce the specular slightly. Okay, so what you get here, again, is a wood texture, and we're basically carving that wood texture out of the tree. And you can adjust the colors, you can adjust the texture. We could do more than just the bump map. For instance, you can add scuffing with roughness and all sorts of stuff like that, but this is the basic technique. So that is carving wood out of a 3D texture. I hope you learned something.